Hi, I'm excited you've joined me today. My name is Hattie Duplichin, and I lead research and evaluation for the Ashoka U team. I'm here to share a bit about our early stage research on learning outcomes across the social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and change-making education spectrum. First, I'll provide a bit of context for the why behind this research, and then I'll jump into some of our early stage findings. For us, the why really starts with Ashoka. In case you're not familiar, Ashoka was founded in 1980 to identify and support social entrepreneurs working around the world. For Ashoka, social entrepreneur, or what we often call systems change social entrepreneur, are really focused on identifying a challenge, understanding the underlying causes of that challenge, iterating to improve the way we grapple with or address that challenge, and ultimately shift the way that everyone is better addressing that challenge or change the system around challenges in our society. Ashoka's identified and selected over 3,500 social entrepreneurs, who we call Ashoka Fellows, that are working around the world, with the hope that if we can provide support and bring them together, their work can scale further, faster, and reach more people. But as Ashoka's work has evolved, it's become clear that only a small percentage of us will or even should become social entrepreneurs. There's a lot of different ways to address social challenges, to work towards social change. And I think that Ashoka is starting to think, or is now thinking about a broad spectrum of social impact. Beyond social entrepreneurship, or we talk about social innovation, which is really focused on that problem solution step in the social entrepreneurship experience, kind of identifying a challenge, coming to understand that underlying cause, those underlying causes of that challenge, and then working to develop ways to address that challenge. And then even more broadly, we talk about change making. Ashoka's real focus right now, is on creating and supporting in everyone a changemaker world where everyone feels empowered to identify challenges, bring people together, and collectively work towards solutions. And so who's Ashoka U, and what's our role within the context of these conversations? Ashoka U was founded in 2008 with a focus on higher education. We work with colleges and universities around the world to embed social innovation and change-making education into the programs they offer, into the experiences that they have, really across their institution, so that all faculty, staff, students, community members feel empowered and are able to step into the role of change makers. And so, why are we talking about learning outcomes within the context of all of this kind of work? The conversation about learning outcomes really evolved from conversations around evaluation. As we were working with different universities, they began to come to us asking about processes for evaluating student learning and social innovation and the impact of social innovation within higher education. And as we had those conversations, it started to become clear that one of the big challenges was around learning outcomes. For everyone working in this space, the direction that they were moving, what they aimed to teach students, was implicit. It was there, but it wasn't always explicit, which makes it difficult to measure, to design approaches to measurement. And even when people did have explicit learning outcomes, people didn't always feel confident that they were the right learning outcomes for students within this space. But even beyond that, I think that social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and change making are still comparatively new fields. And we're still at the early stages of having collective conversations about what it means to prepare people for these fields. But it's really important. It's important to understand the learning outcomes that undergird social entrepreneurship versus social innovation versus change making, because the work can look really different. And to effectively prepare people for these different kinds of work, we need to understand what the learning outcomes are, what they need to know to be effective in that work. And so Ashoka launched at the end of 2017, early 2018, a study of learning outcomes. We're working to map the learning outcomes that people have developed for across social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and change-making education in colleges and universities around the world. We want to understand what learning outcomes are driving this programming collectively, in what ways these different spaces are similar, and in what ways they might be different, the ways the learning outcomes look different, and what kind of programs, offerings, initiatives these learning outcomes are informing. So are we looking at courses? Are we looking at centers? Are we looking at the whole student experience, and how does that make a difference? And so we've done a couple of things. The first stage of our work was really exploratory. We wanted to better understand what was out there, what people were doing. And so we launched a series of semi-structured qualitative interviews. We chatted with 42 people across 28 colleges and universities, 12 nonprofits, 1 for-profit, and 1 K-12 institution. And we're working in 9 different countries, really asking the question, how are you thinking about learning outcomes? What does this work look like for you? We learned a lot about what people were doing and a little bit about the learning outcomes that were undergirding that work. But what really became clear through those conversations was that there is a lot of information out there, and that there was a lot of information that we could explore and that would be powerful for our community to have access to. And so we moved into the second phase of the work, which is to begin sourcing learning outcomes from across the field. So we've collected 21 learning outcomes submissions, and we've also identified 6 publicly available outcomes frameworks from 20 colleges and universities, 6 nonprofits, and 1 K-12 institution across 10 countries. And we're now engaged in qualitative data analysis, specifically thematic textual analysis, to start identifying trends in the way that people were talking about the different learning outcomes and what learning outcomes seem to be prevalent across these spaces. So what are we finding? Within the context of social entrepreneurship, here are what we've identified as the top 5 focus areas in the learning outcomes that we've seen so far. Number 1, identifying opportunities for positive change, or really being able to focus in on a need, essentially. And people talk about that in a lot of different ways, but it's around identifying an opportunity for to address a challenge. Number 2, focused on leadership. I think the language around leadership tends to be pretty vague. There's a lot to leadership, but the learning outcomes that we're seeing aren't necessarily delving into what leadership means, or what it means to develop these skills, or how we might be able to support students in developing them. So I think that there's a lot of space to be more specific about leadership in this context. Then we see communication and interpersonal skills. This tended to fall into 3 different areas. We saw learning outcomes around messaging, and so essentially communicating, particularly externally, to constituencies about your work. There was a lot of points around pitching and marketing and things along these lines. I think you saw relationship building, and I think that tended to focus on building your network, so also fairly externally focused. And then you saw information around, or learning outcomes around, team building, so kind of working with the people more internally to move your work forward, or communicating with people to move your work forward. I think the next area we saw was strategy development. I think the language tended to be pretty broad here as well, but a lot of underneath strategy development were a lot of the different skills that would be required to build a strategy in order to address the opportunity for positive change, or address the challenge that you've identified. And then number 5, evaluation. To look a little bit more specifically on what we mean when we mentioned each of these categories. In the case of purpose-driven work, or a purpose-driven focus, I think you saw language like clarity of purpose, solutions, goals, orientation, ability to identify a challenge, and ability to identify a challenge and an opportunity for change. Within the context of leadership, like I mentioned before, it was a lot of language that was mentioned leadership, but didn't necessarily delve deeply into what leadership meant or could look like. I did like ability to make decisions based on relevant information as an illustration of leadership, and I think more language like that could be really helpful. Around communication and messaging, you saw communication skills, collaboration, gaining buy-in, sharing results, communication and persuasion, and ability to sell and or market to the organization. Relationship building, I think, was another one of those. It came up a lot, but tended not to have a lot of detail around what it means to build relationships. And so I think more illustration could be really helpful with this learning outcome as well. And then you saw team building. So building effective teams, relationship and team building, teamwork skills. One of the things that's interesting in this space, I thought, was a lot of the language really is drawing from kind of some of the business side of the work and the venture development side of the social entrepreneurship work, especially when you see language like persuasion or ability to sell and market to an organization or stakeholder engagement. And I think that in some of the other spaces, it's a little bit different. So social innovation. I would love to be able to share a bit more about this, but we don't actually have enough information yet. We haven't received enough submissions of learning outcomes focused specifically on social innovation independent of social entrepreneurship. We received quite a few that talked about both social entrepreneurship and social innovation, but didn't differentiate the two, which makes it difficult to make a comparison. And so we're still collecting social innovation focused learning outcomes. If this is something that you've developed and that you'd like to share, I'd love to chat with you. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so you can take a look at that. And change making. So this is much more focused on kind of identifying a challenge and collectively working toward a solution, ensuring everyone feels like they can be a part of that process. The language here tended to focus on similar topics, but sounded pretty different. Number one, above and beyond in this space, was focused on communication and interpersonal skills. And so they talked about cultivating relationships and connecting with people. And they also talked about effective listening, communication, and collaboration, and particularly within the context of teams. So what makes a team work well, or what makes communication within the context of a team effective? I think second to emerge, which I thought was interesting and really different than within the social entrepreneurship context, was around self-awareness and personal reflection. I think that within this context, people were really focused on understanding the self in relation to the community that they might work with, the people that they're aiming to support, aiming to serve, aiming to collaborate with, and understanding the implications of those relationships, which I think is really important across a lot of these contexts, or across a lot of the social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and change-making work. Number 3, ethical reasoning and responsibility. 4, we saw a lot of conversation around innovation and creativity. I think this is another one of those that's very rich, but there wasn't necessarily a ton of detail around what it means to what these learning outcomes look like, or what it means to achieve these learning outcomes. So I think more detail there could be really helpful. Facilitating and managing change, and then again, teamwork, cultivating strong teams. So what does this language look like? I think within the context of communication relationships, we see terms like effective social interaction and community and network building, meaningful dialogue, collaboration and alliance building. So similar focus within the context of social entrepreneurship on communication, but different language around what it means to communicate. Self-awareness and personal reflection. You saw language like reflection and introspection, learning from past mistakes, and self-care. Ethical reasoning and responsibility, for instance, taking responsibility for creating a healthier system, which I loved. You also see civic mindedness, and so maybe a bit of an overlap there with the civic engagement field, which I think is something else that's important to explore. For facilitating change, I think, as I mentioned before about innovation, I think this is another one where it could be exciting to parse out more. I think you saw language like facilitating positive change, implementing and managing change, and leadership through ambiguity. And then cultivating teams, you see cultivating healthy teams, collaboration and teamwork, and team building. So this is another one that I think, again, more detail might be interesting. Okay, so this is really just an overview of the learning outcomes that we saw emerge within the context of social entrepreneurship and change making across the areas of knowledge, across the areas of abilities, and across the areas of mindset and values. Social entrepreneurship tended to be a lot heavier on the abilities, and you see a little bit more detail here than you did on some of the other slides. Change making was much heavier on the mindset and values. I think that was where people were particularly leaning within the context of learning outcomes that were more focused on change making. I think that's really just the beginning of the conversation. I think that there's a lot more work that's taking place out there. I think that the other thing about what we've found so far is that these learning outcomes don't necessarily represent a cohesive collection of learning outcomes or an ideal collection of learning outcomes. They're really just an illustration of where people are focusing or where people are putting their energy right now. And so I think a couple of things that are important to think about as we look at these learning outcomes are, one, what seems right, what seems off, and maybe most importantly, what seems like it's missing. Are there things that really are critical to learning and preparing as a social innovator or change maker that we're not necessarily putting our energy in as a field, or even if we are, we're not identifying it in a way that makes it measurable. And so I think that it's an exciting opportunity to continue to have conversations, collaborate, and iterate as we move toward what learning outcomes might look like with across the field. I think the other thing to remember is that learning outcomes are adapted, or have to be adapted, right? So even as we're moving toward kind of a collective vision of what some of the most important outcomes are for social entrepreneurs and social innovators, that doesn't mean those are the only outcomes or the most important outcomes for your students. And so understanding how we take these high-level trends and adapt them for context, adapt them for community, adapt them for students is a really important part of the conversation too. And so a couple of opportunities to be a part of that conversation. We'll be pulling together a resource that we're calling Preparing Students for a Rapidly Changing World. It focuses on the learning outcomes research we're doing, shares examples of the holistic learning outcomes that people are creating, and also delves into case studies around how they've created them, how they've used them, and how they hope to continue to iterate. We have pre-sales open now for that resource. If you want to go to ashoku.org/learning outcomes. In the fall, we're also planning to launch a Commons cohort that's focused on learning outcomes and evaluation. It'll be an opportunity to bring people together with an experienced coach to iterate on developing evaluation for their own campuses and their own work. I think if you want to stay updated with the things that we're working on and news that's coming out, you can sign up at the link at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be sharing lots of information and also lots of opportunities to get involved. And finally, if you have thoughts or questions, I'd love to hear more. Again, my name's Hattie Duplichin, and feel free to reach out to me at hduplichin@ashoka.org. I think I'd love to hear any recommendations you have. If you're interested in sharing social innovation learning outcomes, you can contact me there. And I hope to be able to connect with you and continue this conversation. Thanks so much.